The candles flickered against Marissa's face like tiny flames of judgment, casting shadows that made her smile look sharper than usual. I'd spent 3 hours preparing her favorite meal, chicken mole, the recipe my father had taught me before he died, back when birthdays still meant something warm. The dining room table gleamed under the overhead light, set with the good china she'd insisted we save for special occasions. Tonight felt special enough. It was her 52nd birthday, and I'd invited cousin Rachel over, hoping the family might soften whatever sharp edges had been growing between us lately. "This smells incredible, Elena," Rachel said, settling into her chair with the kind of theatrical appreciation that meant she was trying too hard. "You really went all out." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled, ladling the rich, dark sauce over Marissa's plate with careful precision. The mole had taken hours, roasting chiles, grinding spices, stirring until my wrist ached. Each step felt like an offering, a way to bridge whatever distance had opened between my stepmother and me since I'd started asking questions about college applications. "It's Dad's recipe," I said quietly, meeting Marissa's eyes across the table. "He always said food was how you showed love." Something flickered in her expression. Annoyance, maybe, or something colder. She cut a precise bite, chewed slowly, then set down her fork with deliberate calm. "Your father said a lot of things," she replied, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to end a conversation before it started. "He wasn't always practical about money, though, or planning." Rachel laughed nervously, glancing between us. "Well, the food is amazing. Elena, you should open a restaurant." "Actually," I said, feeling brave in the warm candlelight and family dinner, "I've been thinking about culinary school. There's a program in San Diego that looks perfect, and with Dad's college fund—" Marissa's wineglass hit the table harder than necessary, the crystal ringing like a warning bell. The sound cut through my sentence, leaving it hanging incomplete in the air between us. "Elena, sweetheart," she said. And there was something in the way she said sweetheart that made my chest tighten. "We've talked about this. You need to be realistic about your options." "But Dad always said, your father is dead." The words landed like a slap, sharp and final. Rachel's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "He's been dead for 4 years, and I'm the one who's been taking care of you. I'm the one who kept this house running, who made sure you had food and clothes and a roof over your head while you figured out what you wanted to do with your life." My face burned. The mole suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. "I know that, Marissa. I'm grateful." "Are you?" She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked almost hungry. "Because honestly, Elena, sometimes I wonder how much of a burden you've been. 19 years old and still living at home, still expecting me to solve all your problems?" The room went silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Rachel stared at her plate like she could disappear into the pattern on the china. The candles kept flickering, oblivious to the way the air had turned thick and toxic. "I don't ask you to solve my problems," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I just thought, Dad's college fund." Marissa laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that had nothing to do with humor. "Oh, honey, there is no college fund. There hasn't been for a long time." The words hit me like cold water. I felt something inside my chest crack open, spilling confusion and disbelief into my bloodstream. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your father was a dreamer, not a saver. I mean, the house needed a new roof, and you needed braces, and life is expensive." She dabbed at her lips with the cloth napkin I'd carefully pressed that morning. "The money is gone, Elena. It's been gone since the year after he died." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The dining room suddenly felt too small, too warm, the smell of mole too rich and overwhelming. All those years of her telling me to focus on school first, worry about applications later. All those times she'd changed the subject when I asked about visiting colleges or meeting with guidance counselors. "Elena?" Marissa's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you listening to me?
I looked at her across the table, at this woman who had shared my father's bed and inherited his house and apparently spent his carefully saved money. The candles cast dancing shadows across her face, and for a moment, she looked like a stranger. "I need some air," I whispered, pushing back from the table. "Don't be dramatic," Marissa called after me as I headed for the door. "We'll figure something out. Community college, maybe. Something more realistic." I didn't answer. I walked outside into the cool night air and sat on the front steps, staring at the street where my father used to park his truck. The stars were barely visible through the suburban light pollution, but I looked for them anyway, remembering how he'd point out constellations and tell me they were proof that beautiful things could shine even in the darkness. Inside, I could hear Rachel's voice, gentle and apologetic, and Marissa's responses, calm and reasonable. She was probably explaining how difficult I'd been lately, how ungrateful, how she was doing her best with limited resources. The narrative would be neat and tidy, with her as the long-suffering stepmother and me as the burden she'd generously chosen to bear. But something didn't feel right. Something in the way her eyes had shifted when she mentioned the college fund, in the too quick explanation about roof repairs and braces. I'd gotten those braces when I was 14, 2 years before my father died, and I remembered him checking the balance on that savings account every month, adding whatever he could spare, treating it like the most important number in the world. I sat there until Rachel left, until the house went quiet, until the porch light clicked off and left me in darkness. Then I went inside, past the kitchen where dirty dishes waited like evidence of the evening's small disaster, past the living room where Marissa had retreated with her wine and her wounded dignity. In my room, I pulled out the shoebox where I kept my father's papers, the ones Marissa had let me have after the funeral. Bank statements, insurance documents, the handwritten notes where he'd tracked his savings goals. I spread them across my bed and began to read, looking for the truth hidden in the numbers, searching for my father's voice in the careful records of a man who had never stopped believing in my future. The bank statement crinkled in my hands like autumn leaves, the paper thin from years of careful folding and unfolding. I'd read it so many times I knew the numbers by heart, but tonight they felt different, like a code I'd been too trusting to crack. Elena Ramirez Education Fund, $23,847.62. The date stamp read March 15th, 2021. 3 months before my father died. Below that, his handwriting in blue ink. "Almost there, mija. 2 more years and you'll have everything you need." I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor at 2 in the morning, surrounded by papers that smelled like my father's cologne and the musty storage box where they'd lived since the funeral. Every document told the same story. A man who worked overtime, skipped lunch, drove his truck an extra year past when it should have been replaced, all to build something solid for his daughter's future. But Marissa had said the money was gone, spent on necessities, eaten up by the cost of keeping me alive and housed and fed. The words still echoed in my head, delivered with such casual finality that I'd almost believed them. Almost. I pulled out my laptop and logged into the online banking portal, fingers shaking as I typed the account information my father had made me memorize. "Just in case something happens to me," he'd said, his voice careful and serious. "This money is yours, Elena, no matter what." The page loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, like it was reluctant to reveal its secrets. When it finally appeared, my chest went hollow. Elena Ramirez Education Fund, $127.43. I stared at the number until it blurred. $127 from almost $24,000 to barely enough for textbooks. The transaction history stretched down the screen like a wound, showing withdrawal after withdrawal, each one authorized by M. Blake. Marissa Blake, the secondary account holder my father had added just to make things easier when you're away at college. My phone buzzed against the carpet. A text from Lydia. "Can't sleep. Are you awake?" I called her instead of texting back. She answered on the first ring. "Elena, what's wrong?" Her voice was thick with sleep, but alert, the way it always got when she sensed trouble. "The college fund is gone," I said. And saying it out loud made it real in a way that staring at numbers on a screen hadn't. She took it. Marissa took all of it.
Lydia was quiet for a long moment. I could hear her moving around, probably sitting up in bed, switching on a light. "Tell me everything." So I did. The birthday dinner, Marissa's casual cruelty, the way she'd dismissed my father's promises like they were fairy tales, the bank statement with its devastating proof, the pattern of withdrawals that painted a clear picture of systematic theft. That manipulative, Lydia's voice was sharp with anger. "Elena, this is theft. This is actual criminal theft." "But she was on the account," I said, even though part of me wanted to embrace Lydia's outrage, to let it fuel something stronger than the hollow ache in my chest. Technically, she had legal access. Technical doesn't make it right. That money wasn't meant for her, and she knew it. Your dad trusted her to protect it, not spend it on— What did she say she spent it on? House repairs. My braces. Life is expensive. I pulled up the transaction history again, scrolling through months of withdrawals. But Lydia, look at this. She took $2,000 last Tuesday. What house repair costs exactly $2,000 on a random Tuesday? None that I can think of. Lydia's voice was getting harder, more focused. I could practically hear her gears turning. "Elena, you need to look at your dad's other accounts. Check everything. If she did this to the college fund, she might have done it to other things too." The suggestion made my stomach turn, but I knew she was right. I dug through the papers until I found statements for my father's checking account, his small savings account, even the Christmas fund he'd started the year before he died. One by one, I logged into each account, watching my father's careful financial planning crumble into evidence of betrayal. The checking account, drained except for the minimum balance. The savings account, empty. The Christmas fund, empty. By dawn, I'd created a spreadsheet documenting every suspicious withdrawal, every account that had been systematically emptied, while I lived under the same roof, trusting and grateful, and completely unaware that my future was being sold off piece by piece. I found myself thinking about all the small moments that suddenly made sense. The way Marissa had discouraged me from getting a job in high school, focus on your studies, while subtly creating a financial dependence. The expensive jewelry that had appeared over the years, the kitchen renovation she insisted was necessary, the weekend trips to visit her sister in Phoenix. At 7:30, I called the bank. "First National, this is Brandon speaking. I need to speak with someone about suspicious activity on my account, fraudulent withdrawals. I can transfer you to our fraud department. Can I get your account number?" 10 minutes later, I was explaining the situation to a woman named Sandra, who listened with professional sympathy and asked careful questions about authorization and documentation. The withdrawals were made by someone with legitimate access to the account, but if you believe they were made without your knowledge or against the account's intended purpose, you may want to speak with a legal professional. What if the person who made the withdrawals lied about what the money was for? That would be a matter for law enforcement, Sandra said gently. We can provide transaction records if you need them for an investigation. After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom surrounded by evidence of my father's love and Marissa's betrayal, trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. The safe choice was to say nothing, to let sleeping dogs lie, to find another way to pay for college, or maybe just accept that dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford. But as the morning light filtered through my bedroom window, illuminating the handwritten notes where my father had tracked every dollar saved, every overtime shift worked, every small sacrifice made in service of my future, I felt something harder than grief settling in my chest. My father had believed in me enough to work himself to exhaustion, The least I could do was believe in myself enough to fight for what he'd built. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to the fraud department requesting complete transaction records for all accounts. Then I started researching lawyers who specialized in financial crimes. If Marissa thought she could steal my future and serve it back to me as a life lesson about realistic expectations, she had severely underestimated her stepdaughter. Lydia's coffee shop sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, the kind of place where the baristas knew your order and the Wi-Fi password was written on a chalkboard next to hand-drawn hearts. I'd been coming here since high school, but today it felt different. Less like a casual hangout spot and more like a war room. I claimed a corner table, spreading my father's documents across the scratched wooden surface like battle plans. When Lydia arrived, she took one look at my face and ordered 2 large coffees without asking what I wanted. She slid into the chair across from me, her dark eyes immediately scanning the papers I'd arranged with obsessive precision.
Jesus, Elena, she whispered, picking up a bank statement. This is worse than I thought. $23,847, I said. The number's as familiar now as my own birthday. Gone in less than 3 years. Do you know how many shifts my dad worked to save that much? Lydia studied the transaction history, her finger tracing the pattern of withdrawals. Look at this, she said, pointing to a cluster of large amounts. November through January. 8,000, 5,000, 3,000. That's not house repairs, Elena. That's something big. I'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing Lydia say it made it feel more real. Investment, I said. Or gambling. Or maybe she just decided she deserved it more than I did. Don't do that. Lydia's voice was sharp. Don't make this about deserving. Your dad saved that money for you. It was never hers to take, no matter what story she's telling herself. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, letting the warmth seep through my palms. Around us, the normal sounds of morning life continued. Espresso machines hissing, conversations about weekend plans, the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic. But I felt separate from it all, like I was watching through glass. I keep thinking about all the times she made me feel guilty. Every time I asked about college visits or application deadlines, she'd get this look, like I was being ungrateful, like I should be satisfied with what I had instead of asking for more. Because she knew, Lydia said simply. She knew there was no money left, and instead of admitting what she'd done, she made you feel bad for wanting what your dad promised you. The truth of it settled over me like a weight. All those months of self-doubt, of wondering if I was being too ambitious, too demanding, all those nights I'd lain awake thinking maybe Marissa was right, maybe I should be more realistic about my future. She'd been gaslighting me while spending my inheritance. I feel so stupid, I said. You're not stupid. You're trusting. There's a difference. Lydia leaned forward, her intense voice. Elena, your dad worked himself sick to give you options. He died believing you'd go to college, maybe become a chef or a teacher or whatever you wanted. He didn't know Marissa would steal that from you. She was right, but the knowledge felt like carrying stones in my chest. What am I supposed to do now? The money's gone. Even if I could prove she took it, which would mean accusing my stepmother of theft, I still can't get it back if she's already spent it. Maybe not, Lydia said. But you can't just let her win. You can't let her rewrite history and pretend your dad didn't plan for your future. I thought about the previous evening, about Marissa's casual dismissal of my father's promises. The way she'd made his love sound like weakness, his dreams for me sound like foolishness. Even if I never saw a penny of that money again, something in me rebelled against letting that narrative stand unchallenged. I've been keeping a journal, I said, pulling out a small notebook I had started after the birthday dinner disaster. Writing down everything I remember, every conversation about money, every time she discouraged me from applying to schools, every excuse she gave for why we couldn't visit campuses. Lydia flipped through the pages, reading entries I had written in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. This is good, she said. This is evidence of a pattern. She wasn't just stealing money, she was stealing your confidence, making you doubt your own worth so you wouldn't ask questions. But what can I actually do with it? I don't know yet, Lydia admitted, but I know you can't give up. Your dad worked all those extra shifts so you could settle for community college and a life of wondering what if. She was right, but the path forward felt impossibly steep. Fighting Marissa meant risking the only home I had, the only family connection left from my father's life. It meant potential legal battles I couldn't afford, conversations with authorities I wasn't sure would believe me, conflict that might tear apart what little stability remained in my world. I'm scared, I said quietly. Of course you are. But Elena, Lydia reached across the table and grabbed my hand. What scares you more? Fighting for what's yours or spending the rest of your life knowing you let her win? I closed my eyes and tried to imagine two different versions of my future. In one, I accepted Marissa's version of reality, enrolled in community college, got a job, lived small and grateful and safe. In the other, I fought back, demanded answers, risked everything for the chance to honor my father's dreams and reclaim my own. When I opened my eyes, Lydia was watching me with the kind of steady confidence I'd always envied. She never doubted herself the way I did, never second-guessed her right to take up space in the world. I need to know where the money went, I said, finally. If she spent $24,000, there has to be a trail. Bills, receipts, bank records showing where it landed. Now you're talking. Lydia's smile was fierce. And I bet if you start paying attention, you'll notice things you missed before. When someone's hiding something this big, they can't be perfect about covering their tracks.
She was right. Already I was remembering details that hadn't seemed significant at the time. The hushed phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. The way Marissa had started taking her mail directly from the mailbox instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter. The expensive handbag she'd claimed was a gift from her sister, even though her sister worked at a grocery store and lived paycheck to paycheck. I'm going to start watching her, I said. Really watching. Not just accepting her explanations for things. And documenting everything, Lydia added. Every conversation, every suspicious detail, every time she contradicts herself. If she's hiding something, eventually she'll slip up. As I walked home that afternoon, my father's papers tucked securely in my backpack, I felt something shifting inside me. The grief and betrayal were still there, but underneath them was growing something harder and more focused. Determination, maybe? Or just the simple recognition that I deserved better than the small, apologetic life Marissa had been training me to accept. That evening, I sat at my bedroom desk and wrote in my journal. Day 2, after finding out about the money. Today, I decided to stop accepting Marissa's version of the truth. Dad didn't work himself to death so I could be grateful for scraps. He worked himself to death so I could have choices. It's time I started acting like his daughter instead of her victim. I closed the journal and looked around my room. At the photos of my father, at the acceptance letters from culinary schools I'd been afraid to open, at the future I'd been convinced I couldn't afford. Tomorrow, I would start paying attention to the life happening around me instead of just surviving it. If Marissa had secrets, I was going to find them. And if she thought she could steal my future without consequences, she was about to learn that my father had raised a fighter, not a doormat. The game was just beginning. Mrs. Norris had always been the kind of neighbor who noticed things. Which flowers bloomed first in spring, when someone's newspaper stayed on the porch too long, the subtle changes in routine that marked life's quiet dramas. At 73, she moved through her garden with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to pay attention to details. And this morning, she was deadheading roses with surgical precision when I walked to check our mailbox. "Elena, dear," she called softly, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she had something important to say. "Could you help me with something inside? These old hands aren't what they used to be." I glanced back at the house where Marissa's bedroom curtains were still drawn against the late morning sun. She'd been sleeping later lately, sometimes not emerging until noon, with dark circles under her eyes and a brittle energy that made the house feel charged with tension. Of course, Mrs. Norris. Her living room was exactly what you'd expect from a retired English teacher. built-in bookshelves stuffed with worn paperbacks, Afghans draped over every chair, the lingering scent of Earl Grey and lemon cookies. But instead of leading me toward whatever tasks supposedly needed my young hands, she guided me to her kitchen window, the one that faced our house at an angle that revealed our side door and driveway. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, her fingers working at the edge of her cardigan. "About your stepmother. About the visitors she's been having." My stomach tightened. "Visitors?" Mrs. Norris glanced toward our house, then back at me with the careful expression of someone who had spent decades learning which truths needed to be shared and which were better left unspoken. "They come at night, usually around 10 or 11 when most folks are settling in for the evening. Expensive cars, Mercedes, BMWs, the kind that purr instead of rumble. They park at the end of your driveway, not in front of the house where neighbors might notice." I felt my pulse quicken. "How long has this been going on?" 8 months, maybe 9. Always the same pattern. They arrive at dark, stay for an hour or two, leave separately. Usually 2 or 3 men, sometimes a woman, professional-looking, carrying briefcases or manila envelopes. 8 months. Right around the time the large withdrawals from my father's accounts had begun. "Mrs. Norris," I said carefully, "why are you telling me this now?" She turned from the window to face me fully, her blue eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that probably made her a formidable teacher. "Because last night I couldn't sleep, arthritis acting up, and I saw something that worried me. Your stepmother was out there in the driveway with 2 men, and she was crying. Not sad crying, Elena, scared crying, desperate." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too small. I thought about Marissa's recent behavior, the way she'd been jumping when the phone rang, the muttered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the expensive wine she'd been drinking more frequently. "Did you hear what they were saying?"
Mrs. Norris shook her head. "They were keeping their voices low, but Elena, honey, in 40 years of living on this street, I've learned to recognize certain types of trouble. This feels like money trouble, the dangerous kind." She moved to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind teachers used to track assignments. The pages were filled with her neat handwriting, dates, times, license plate numbers when she could see them clearly. "I've been keeping track," she said simply. "Call it an old habit from dealing with school administrators who didn't always tell the truth. Documentation matters." I stared at the notebook, this careful record of my stepmother's secret life. The dates lined up perfectly with the bank withdrawals I'd been documenting. Whatever Marissa had done with my father's money, it was connected to these late-night visitors. "Mrs. Norris, could I borrow this? Or make copies?" "You can have it," she said, pressing the notebook into my hands. "Elena, I taught high school for 35 years. I know the difference between a child who's troubled and a child who's in trouble. You've been carrying something heavy lately, and if these notes help you understand what's happening in your own home, then I'm glad I kept them." I felt tears prick at my eyes. In a world where Marissa had spent months making me doubt my own perceptions, Mrs. Norris's careful attention felt like a lifeline. "Thank you," I whispered. "There's something else. Yesterday morning, after the men left, I saw your stepmother in the backyard. She was digging near the old oak tree, the one by your father's workshop. Digging, and then filling the hole back in. It seemed odd." My father's workshop. He'd built it himself the year before he died. A small shed where he tinkered with engines and kept his tools organized with obsessive precision. After the funeral, Marissa had padlocked it, claiming she couldn't bear to go through his things yet. 4 years later, it remained locked. "Mrs. Norris, what do you think she buried?" "I don't know, dear, but people don't usually bury things in their backyard unless they don't want them found."
and they don't usually cry while talking to men in expensive cars unless the conversation isn't going their way. I hugged the notebook to my chest, feeling its weight like evidence, like proof that I wasn't imagining the wrongness I'd been sensing for months. "If you need anything," Mrs. Norris said as she walked me to the door, "if you feel unsafe or uncertain, you come here, day or night. I may be old, but I'm not helpless, and I've got a phone that works just fine for calling the police." Walking back across the street, I felt like I was seeing my house for the first time, not as the safe haven where my father had raised me, but as a stage where Marissa had been performing normalcy while conducting some kind of business that required darkness and secrecy and scared her enough to make her cry. That afternoon, while Marissa was out running errands, I slipped into the backyard and found the spot Mrs. Norris had described. The ground near the oak tree was disturbed, the grass slightly different in color where it had been replanted. I knelt and pressed my palm to the earth, wondering what lay beneath. In my room that evening, I opened Mrs. Norris's notebook and began comparing her careful observations with my own documentation. The pattern was unmistakable. Every large withdrawal from my father's accounts corresponded with increased visitor activity. Whatever scheme Marissa was involved in, it was systematic, ongoing, and apparently not going as well as she had hoped. I thought about the scared crying Mrs. Norris had witnessed, about expensive cars and professional-looking people who conducted business after dark. This wasn't just theft. It was something bigger, more complex, more dangerous. I opened my laptop and began researching fraud investigation services, victim advocacy groups, anyone who might help me understand what I was dealing with. If Marissa thought she could steal my future and use our house as headquarters for whatever criminal enterprise she had gotten herself into, she had made a serious miscalculation. My father had taught me that problems were just puzzles that hadn't been solved yet. Looking at Mrs. Norris's careful documentation spread across my desk, I felt like I was finally beginning to see the shape of this particular puzzle, and I was going to solve it. The FBI field office in downtown looked nothing like I had expected. No imposing government architecture or intimidating security. Just a modest building tucked between a sandwich shop and an insurance agency, with glass doors that reflected my nervous face back at me as I stood on the sidewalk, gathering courage. I'd spent 3 days researching before making the call. 3 days reading about white-collar crime, financial fraud, the difference between civil theft and federal offenses. The internet had been both helpful and overwhelming. Forums full of people who'd been scammed by investment schemes, legal websites explaining terms like wire fraud and mail fraud, victim advocacy groups with stories that made my situation seem almost quaint by comparison. But it was the phrase pattern of criminal activity that had finally convinced me to dial the number. Mrs. Norris's notebook, combined with my father's bank records, painted a picture that was bigger than just my stolen college fund. If Marissa was running some kind of ongoing scheme, other people might be getting hurt too. Detective Karen Willis met me in a small conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and burnt coffee. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail without making me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Thank you for coming in, Elena," she said, settling across from me with a yellow legal pad and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest FBI Agent. Why don't you start from the beginning and tell me what's been happening?" So I did. The birthday dinner disaster, the missing college fund, Mrs. Norris's careful documentation of late-night visitors. I spread my father's bank statements across the table like evidence in a trial, pointing out the pattern of withdrawals, the systematic draining of accounts he'd spent years building. Karen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression neutral but attentive. When I finished, she reviewed the documents methodically, asking questions that revealed she understood financial crime in ways I was still learning. These withdrawal amounts, she said, pointing to a cluster of transactions, they're just under $10,000 each. That's not a coincidence. Banks are required to report cash transactions of $10,000 or more to the government. Your stepmother was structuring these withdrawals to avoid triggering those reports. Is that illegal? If it's done to evade reporting requirements, yes, it's called structuring, and it's a federal crime. Karen made another note. Elena, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has your stepmother ever asked you to sign documents you didn't read? Put your name on any accounts or applications? The question made my stomach drop. She had me sign some insurance papers after Dad died, said it was just updating beneficiaries and things like that. And there was something about the house deed. She said it was to make sure I'd inherit properly if anything happened to her. Karen's pen stopped moving. Do you remember what those documents actually said? Not really. I was still pretty messed up from losing Dad, and Marissa was handling everything. She said I didn't need to worry about the details, that she was protecting me. Elena, I'm going to need copies of every document you signed, every piece of paperwork related to your father's estate. Can you get those? I think so. Marissa keeps important papers in a filing cabinet in the den. Good. But don't let her know you're looking for them. If she realizes you're suspicious, she might destroy evidence or disappear entirely. The word disappear hit me like cold water. Until that moment, some part of me had still been thinking of this as a family problem, something that could be resolved with difficult conversations and maybe some counseling. But Karen was talking about federal crimes and destroyed evidence and people who might run rather than face consequences. Detective Willis, I said carefully, how serious is this? Are we talking about actual jail time? Karen leaned back in her chair, studying me with what looked like gentle sympathy. Elena, based on what you've shown me, your stepmother has potentially committed multiple federal crimes. Bank fraud, structuring, possibly wire fraud if she used electronic transfers to move money. If she's running an investment scam or Ponzi scheme, which is what your neighbor's observations suggest, we could be looking at dozens of additional victims. She pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. I'm going to open a preliminary investigation. That means I'll start looking into your stepmother's financial activities, cross-referencing them with other fraud cases we're working on. But I need you to keep acting normal at home. Don't confront her. Don't let her know you've contacted us. Don't do anything that might spook her into running. How long will the investigation take? That depends on what we find. Could be weeks, could be months. Financial crimes are complex. We need to trace money trails, identify victims, and build a case that will hold up in court. I thought about going home to the house where Marissa was probably making lunch, planning to ask about my day with that forced brightness she'd been using lately. The idea of pretending everything was normal while knowing the FBI was investigating her felt surreal. Detective Willis, what if she figures out that I'm the one who reported her? Karen's expression softened slightly. Elena, I know this is frightening. You're essentially blowing the whistle on someone you live with, someone who's been a parental figure in your life. But you need to understand, if your stepmother is running a criminal enterprise, you're not just a victim, you're potentially in danger. People who commit financial crimes often escalate when they feel cornered. The word danger settled over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about Mrs. Norris's description of Marissa crying in the driveway, scared and desperate. What did desperate people do when they ran out of options?
Is there anything I should watch out for? Any warning signs that she might be planning something? Unusual packing or travel preparations, large cash withdrawals beyond her normal pattern, attempts to get you to sign additional documents. And Elena, Karen leaned forward, her voice serious, if you ever feel unsafe, If your stepmother becomes aggressive or threatening, you call 911 first and me second. Don't try to handle it alone. She stood and gathered the copies of documents I'd brought. I'll be in touch within a week. In the meantime, document everything, but don't take any unusual risks to get information. We'll gather evidence through proper channels. As I walked back to my car, the autumn air felt sharper, more real than it had in months. For the first time since discovering the missing college fund, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. Someone with actual authority believed my story, understood the seriousness of what had happened, and was going to do something about it. But I also felt the weight of secrets settling around me like armor. Tonight, I would go home and make dinner, ask Marissa about her day, pretend to care about whatever drama was unfolding in her life. I would smile and nod and play the role of the grateful stepdaughter while knowing that federal agents were digging into her criminal activities. My father had always said that doing the right thing wasn't always the same as doing the easy thing. As I drove home through familiar neighborhoods that suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers and unknown secrets, I finally understood what he meant. The investigation had begun, and there was no going back. Marissa was making pancakes when I came downstairs the next morning, humming softly as she flipped each one with theatrical precision. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter, warm and domestic in a way that would have felt comfortable a week ago. Now it felt like performance art. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said without turning around, her voice carrying that artificially bright tone she'd been using since our birthday dinner confrontation. "I thought we could have a nice breakfast together. We haven't been talking much lately." I poured myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching her move around the space my father had designed for family meals. She was wearing the silk robe he'd given her for their second anniversary, the one she claimed was too nice for everyday use. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and she'd put on makeup before coming downstairs to cook. "That's thoughtful," I said carefully. "Any special occasion?" She laughed, the sound just a little too loud for the quiet morning. "Can't I make breakfast for my stepdaughter without a special occasion? We're family, Elena. Family takes care of each other." The word family felt like a stone in my throat. I watched her arrange pancakes on a plate with the same meticulous attention she gave to everything. She wanted to look perfect. 3 pancakes, butter melting in precise pats, syrup drizzled in an elegant spiral. "I've been thinking," she continued, settling across from me with her own plate, "about what we discussed the other night, about college and your future and being realistic about options." Here it comes, I thought, the performance I'd been expecting since Detective Willis warned me to act normal. "I may have been too harsh," Marissa said, cutting her pancakes into neat squares. "Your father did leave some money for your education. Not as much as he hoped maybe, but something." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Really?" "Really. There might be enough for a semester or 2 at the community college, maybe some vocational training. We'll need to be careful with it, budget properly, but I think we can make it work." She was offering me crumbs of my own inheritance, serving them up like generosity. I thought about Detective Willis's business card tucked in my wallet, about Mrs. Norse's notebook documenting months of suspicious activity, and the federal investigation that was probably already beginning. "That's wonderful, Marissa. Thank you for reconsidering." Her smile was brilliant and empty. "Of course, sweetheart. I know I can be protective sometimes, but it's only because I care about you. I don't want you to be disappointed or hurt." I nodded and made appreciative sounds about the pancakes, but my attention was focused on the subtle wrongness of the scene. Marissa was trying too hard, talking too much, her gestures just slightly too animated. It reminded me of the way she'd acted at my father's funeral, gracious and grief-stricken and perfectly appropriate, while somehow managing to make herself the center of every conversation. After breakfast, she retreated to her bedroom with what she claimed was a headache. I heard her on the phone through the closed door, her voice low and urgent, the tone she used for conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear.
I washed dishes and pretended not to notice when she emerged 20 minutes later with red-rimmed eyes and the kind of forced composure that suggested she'd been crying. "I need to run some errands," she announced, grabbing her purse and keys with unnecessary efficiency. "I'll be back this afternoon. Do you need any help? I don't have classes until tomorrow."
No, just boring adult stuff. Bills and banking, you know how it is. But I did know how it was now. I watched from the living room window as she backed out of the driveway with the careful precision of someone trying not to draw attention. Her car disappeared around the corner, and I waited exactly 10 minutes before going to the den where she kept her filing cabinet. The top drawer was locked, but the second drawer opened easily. Inside were folders labeled with the kind of obsessive organization my father had taught me to recognize as a red flag. Too neat, too careful. The filing system of someone who was trying very hard to keep track of complicated lies. I found the folder marked Elena, legal documents, and pulled it out with shaking hands. Inside were papers I'd signed without reading, trusting her to handle the details while I was still numb with grief. The insurance documents looked legitimate, but there were others. Applications for credit cards in my name, a loan application using the house as collateral, forms registering something called Ramirez Family Investments as a business entity, with me listed as a partner. My hands started shaking as I photographed each document with my phone. She'd used my name, my father's memory, my grief-addled signature to create some kind of fake investment company. The dates on the paperwork coincided exactly with the beginning of the suspicious withdrawals from my father's accounts. I was still photographing when I heard her car in the driveway. I shoved the papers back into the folder, slammed the drawer closed, and made it to the kitchen just as her key turned in the front door. When she walked in, I was standing at the sink, rinsing out a coffee mug with what I hoped looked like casual innocence. "How were your errands?" I asked. Something flickered across her face. Suspicion, maybe, or just the exhaustion of maintaining her performance. "Fine," she said shortly. "Just fine." But she wasn't fine. Over the next few days, the cracks in her mask became impossible to ignore. She jumped when the phone rang, checked the locks twice before bed, stood at windows looking out at the street like she was expecting someone. The expensive cars Mrs. Norris had documented stopped coming, but Marissa's anxiety only seemed to increase. I found her in my father's workshop one evening, standing in the doorway with the padlock in her hand, staring at his tools like they might offer answers to questions I couldn't hear. When she noticed me watching, she quickly snapped the lock back in place. "Just checking on things," she said, but her voice was hollow. "Maybe we should clean it out," I suggested carefully. "Donate his tools to someone who could use them." "No," the word came out sharp, almost panicked. "Not yet. I'm not ready yet." That night, I heard her moving around the house long after I'd gone to bed. Footsteps in the hallway, drawers opening and closing, the sound of papers rustling. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about my father's workshop, about secrets buried under the oak tree, about the college fund that had vanished like smoke while I trusted the person who was supposed to protect it. The next morning, Marissa was gone before I woke up. No note, no explanation, just an empty house that felt charged with the electricity of unfinished business. I called Detective Willis from my bedroom, speaking quietly even though I was alone. "She's getting desperate," I told her. "Something's changed. She's scared, and she's not hiding it as well anymore." "That's actually good news," Karen said. "Scared people make mistakes. Keep documenting everything, Elena, but be extra careful. We're getting close to something, and that's when situations can become dangerous." As I hung up the phone, I wondered what my father would think about the investigation I'd set in motion, about the federal agents who were probably tracing his carefully saved money through whatever criminal enterprise his widow had built. I thought he'd be proud that I was fighting for the future he had worked so hard to provide. but I also knew he'd be heartbroken that it had come to this. Outside my window, Mrs. Norris was tending her garden, moving slowly among the roses with the patient attention of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. I watched her work and tried to imagine what it would feel like when this was all over, when the truth was finally exposed and justice had been served. But first, we had to get through whatever desperate measures Marissa was planning, and based on the fear I'd seen in her eyes lately, I suspected those measures were coming soon. Detective Willis called on a Tuesday morning while Marissa was in the shower. Her voice was crisp, professional, but I could hear the undercurrent of excitement that meant the investigation was moving forward. "We've identified at least 12 other victims," she said without preamble. "Your stepmother was running a classic Ponzi scheme, using your father's money and your identity to create the appearance of a legitimate investment company."
I sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of it settling over me. 12 other families whose savings had disappeared into Marissa's carefully constructed lie. How much money are we talking about? Close to $200,000, possibly more. She was promising 20% returns on investments in renewable energy projects that didn't exist. Your college fund was probably used to pay early investors to make the scheme look legitimate. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too bright. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Norris watering her roses, oblivious to the federal case unfolding next door. What happens now? We're preparing to execute search warrants, probably within the next few days. Elena, this is important. You cannot give her any indication that law enforcement is involved. If she suspects we're closing in, she might destroy evidence or flee. She's already acting paranoid, I said, thinking about the way Marissa had been checking locks, jumping at sounds, disappearing for hours without explanation. Last night, I heard her on the phone telling someone she needed more time to fix things. That's probably her trying to keep investors calm. Ponzi schemes collapse when people start asking for their money back, and it sounds like that's happening. After Detective Willis hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen thinking about 12 families who had trusted Marissa with their futures. People like my father who had worked extra shifts and skipped lunches to save money they thought would grow into something larger. She had stolen not just from me, but from strangers who believed her promises about clean energy and guaranteed returns. When Marissa came downstairs, her hair wet from the shower, she moved with the jittery energy of someone running on caffeine and desperation. She made coffee with shaking hands, dropping the sugar bowl and cursing under her breath as white crystals scattered across the counter. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Fine," she snapped, then caught herself. "Sorry, sweetheart. I didn't sleep well. Just some business stress. Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worried about the FBI agents who might arrive any day, about what Marissa might do if she realized the walls were closing in, about living in a house with someone who had spent years lying to my face while stealing my father's legacy. That afternoon, she disappeared again, returning hours later with red eyes and the hollow expression of someone who had received very bad news. She went straight to her room and closed the door, and I heard her making phone calls in the urgent, pleading tone of someone trying to convince people not to abandon her. At dinner, she barely touched her food, pushing pasta around her plate while staring at nothing. The silence stretched between us like a held breath until she finally spoke. "Elena, if something were to happen to me, hypothetically, you'd be okay, right? You're 19. Could you take care of yourself?" The question made my skin crawl. What kind of something? "Oh, if I had to travel suddenly for work, or if there was some kind of family emergency with my sister." Her smile was brittle, unconvincing. "I just want to make sure you'd be prepared." I nodded and made reassuring sounds, but inside, I was calculating distances to exits, remembering Detective Willis's warnings about cornered criminals becoming dangerous. Marissa wasn't just scared anymore. She was planning something. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since moving back home.
The sound that woke me wasn't quite identifiable at first, a heavy thudding that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like thunder trapped inside the house. I sat up in bed, disoriented, my mind struggling to place the noise in the context of our quiet suburban street at 5:30 in the morning. Then I heard the shouting. FBI, search warrant, open the door. My heart slammed against my ribs as the reality hit me. This was it, the moment Detective Willis had warned me about, the collapse of Marissa's carefully constructed world of lies. I threw on a robe and opened my bedroom door just as the front door splintered inward with a crack that seemed to shake the whole house. Agents in tactical gear flooded into our hallway, their movements precise and coordinated, voices calling out room locations like they'd memorized the floor plan. The ordinary space where I ate breakfast yesterday morning was suddenly full of strangers with badges and weapons, transforming our home into a crime scene. Elena Ramirez, a woman in a navy jacket, appeared at the top of the stairs. "I'm Agent Martinez. Are you okay? We need you to come downstairs and wait in the living room while we execute the search warrant." I nodded, mute with shock, and followed her down to where other agents were already photographing and cataloging everything. The filing cabinet in the den stood open, its contents spread across the floor like evidence of a life lived in careful deception. Marissa emerged from her bedroom in handcuffs, flanked by 2 agents. Her hair was disheveled, her face streaked with tears. But what struck me most was the way she looked at me, with pure, concentrated hatred, as if I had personally orchestrated her downfall rather than simply refused to be complicit in her crimes. "You little bitch," she hissed as they led her past where I stood frozen in the living room doorway. "After everything I did for you, after I took care of you when no one else would?" One of the agents quietly redirected her toward the front door, but her words hung in the air like smoke. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was trying to rewrite history to make herself the victim and me the ungrateful betrayer. Detective Willis appeared beside me as we watched them load Marissa into the back of an unmarked sedan. "Are you all right?" I wasn't sure how to answer that question. I felt hollow and vindicated and terrified all at once, like I'd been holding my breath for months and suddenly didn't remember how to exhale normally. "Is it over?" "The arrest is just the beginning," she said gently. "There'll be a trial, restitution hearings, a lot of legal proceedings. But, Elena, you did the right thing. 12 families are going to get some of their money back because you were brave enough to speak up." Through the living room window, I could see neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the unusual activity of federal agents carrying boxes out of our house. Mrs. Norris stood in her front yard, her hand pressed to her heart, watching the scene unfold with the kind of shocked recognition that meant she understood exactly what her careful documentation had helped accomplish. What happens to me now? You get your life back, the real one, not the version she was training you to accept. As the last of the agents departed, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and strange, I thought about my father and what he would have made of this morning. I thought he would have been proud that I'd fought for the future he'd worked so hard to provide, even if it meant destroying the only family connection I had left. The college acceptance letters I'd been afraid to open were still stacked on my desk upstairs, waiting for me to believe I deserved the dreams they represented. For the first time in months, I felt ready to find out what those dreams might cost and whether I was brave enough to pay the price. The silence in the house wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. The first thing I did after the FBI finished processing the scene was call a locksmith. By noon, every lock in the house had been changed, and I was the only one with keys. It felt symbolic somehow, this act of taking control over who could enter the space where my father had raised me and Marissa had betrayed me. The second thing I did was open every window, letting October air sweep through rooms that had felt suffocated by secrets. I wanted to clear out the lingering sense of deception, to make space for whatever came next. Lydia arrived that afternoon with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine she claimed
was for celebrating justice. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Marissa had served me crumbs of my own inheritance just days before, and I told her everything about the raid, about seeing my stepmother in handcuffs, about the hollow feeling of watching someone's carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. I keep expecting to feel more satisfied, like she stole from me and 11 other families, she got caught, she's going to face consequences. Shouldn't I feel more vindicated? Maybe the satisfaction comes later. Right now, you're probably still in shock. This has been your whole reality for years, living with her, accepting her version of events, trying to keep peace. That doesn't just disappear because the FBI arrested her. She's right. Even with Marissa gone, I caught myself listening for her footsteps, expecting her voice from the next room. The house felt too quiet, too large, like I was rattling around inside a shell that had been designed for more people. Knocking on the back door that evening, Mrs. Norris carried a casserole dish and wearing the kind of gentle smile that meant she understood I might need practical help along with emotional support. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," she said, settling the dish on my counter. "Tuna noodle casserole. Not fancy, but filling." "Thank you. For the food and for—" I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything she'd done. "Your notebook was crucial evidence. I'm glad it helped. Elena, I hope you know that what happened wasn't your fault. That woman took advantage of your grief and your trust. There's no shame in being fooled by someone who deceived their profession." After she left, I walked through the house room by room, really looking at the space for the first time in years. In the living room, I found the photo of my father that Marissa had moved to an inconspicuous shelf, relegating his memory to make room for her preferred decorative scheme.
Moved it back to the mantel, where his smile could oversee the room he'd designed for family gatherings. In the den, I gathered up all the papers the FBI had left behind, legitimate documents mixed with evidence of Marissa's crimes. I sorted them carefully, keeping what belonged to my father's legacy and disposing of everything connected to the fake investment company that had used my name without my knowledge. The hardest room to enter was my father's workshop. I finally used the bolt cutters I'd borrowed from Mrs. Norris to remove the padlock Marissa had installed. Inside, his tools hung on pegboard exactly as he'd left them, organized with the precision of someone who believed in taking care of things that took care of you. The air smelled like motor oil and sawdust, scents that brought back Saturday mornings when I'd helped him rebuild engines and learned that most problems had solutions if you were patient enough to find them. On his workbench, I found the journal he'd kept during his final months. Pages filled with his plans for my education, calculations about tuition costs, notes about the dreams he was working to make possible. Reading his careful handwriting, I felt the full weight of what Marissa had stolen. Not just money, but his hope, his belief in my future, the legacy he'd built one overtime shift at a time. That night, I called the admissions office at the culinary school in San Diego. The woman who answered was kind when I explained my situation. Family financial difficulties, legal complications that were now resolved, delayed but serious interest in enrollment. "Our spring semester starts in January," she said. "If you can submit your application and financial aid paperwork by December 1st, we can probably work something out." After I hung up, I spread my father's journal across the kitchen table next to the acceptance letters I'd been afraid to open. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the occasional car, normal suburban evening sounds that reminded me I was safe, that the worst was over, that I could start building the future Marissa had tried to steal. I opened the first acceptance letter and began to read about possibilities I was finally brave enough to claim. Marissa's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 months after her sentencing. The return address showed the federal correctional facility in Arizona, where she was serving her 5-year sentence for wire fraud and money laundering.
Elena, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far. The investment opportunity seemed so promising at first, and when it started falling apart, I panicked. I was trying to protect you from losing everything your father worked for. I hope someday you can forgive me. I'm still your family, and family should stick together. Please consider visiting. Marissa. I read it twice, then set it aside, and picked up my father's journal instead. His final entry, written just weeks before he died, was simple. Elena accepted to 3 culinary schools today. All that overtime was worth it. She's going to do amazing things. I walked to the mailbox and dropped in my own letter. The completed enrollment forms for the San Diego Culinary Institute, along with a check for the first semester's tuition. The restitution funds from Marissa's case wouldn't cover everything my father had originally saved, but they were enough for a start. The rest I'd earn through work study and summer jobs, the way thousands of other students built their futures one shift at a time. Marissa's letter went into the kitchen trash. Unopened dreams and false apologies disposed of together. Some chapters of your life deserve to be closed permanently. I had work to do.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.